Hello, welcome to Podsongs, where we interview inspirational people as inspiration for a new song. Today, my guest, co-host and musical collaborator is Amanda Ann Platt, and her guest is Elaine Pagels. Maybe we could jump in, Amanda, and just talk about the music, because normally I do this half an hour with the band before and then, but as you've gone to the trouble of going all the way to see your guest, which has never happened before,
Because it really never happened before.
Never happened yet. So maybe we could just start by talking about, why you drove all the way there, and why you chose this guest.
Sure. Yeah. So this has been, as you will know, I struggled a lot with picking somebody to interview. I was very intimidated by the idea of choosing a hero or somebody who I really admired enough to, not that I don't admire people, but who I both admired enough to want to do this and also felt like I could have a conversation with. So it was just, we had a very rough summer. My family has had some pretty big losses this year, and just a lot of grief and uncertainty. And a friend gave me Elaine's book called Why Religion, which is a beautiful memoir that she wrote. I think it came out in 2018, so years old now, but and that book, and she'll be able to describe it much more eloquently than I could, but in that book she talks about her life work, which is in the field of religious studies. She's done a lot with the so-called Gnostic Gospels, which I know you're not using that term so much anymore, but just which are more sort of geared towards the inner experience. Am I saying that right? Sort of.
Yes, these are texts that were circulating in early Christian groups, and were censored by the bishops in the 4th century and declared to be heresy, which means choice, and choice they thought was very bad to people. So oddly they censored it all. And they're mystical texts, frankly. And the bishops didn't like that. I'm going to sort of try to destroy this.
So if my friend sent me this book, I was not raised in any kind of religious household. I'm not particularly religious myself, and neither is my friend who sent me the book. But I think she sent it to me sort of as chicken soup for the soul, so to speak. She just felt there was a message in the book that I could really benefit from, and I did. I mean, the book was enormously helpful to me. And it's just been the way that we sort of, this interview came together was really just, the timing of things is very odd, just with just some tragedy in my life, and reading the book, and then Elaine agreeing to do the interview. And the reason that first of all, I've been wanting to just take a trip and get up north. I grew up in New York. I live in North Carolina now. I don't get back to New York very often. And so I wanted to just sort of get on the road and see friends. And also it was just, I'm somebody who I feel like, especially as a songwriter, I really like to just be able to get people's energy.
Yeah.
There's been so much on Zoom in the past few years. And I just, when I learned that Elaine had agreed to the interview, I was just like, well, I'd really love to be able to sit down with her. If at all possible, it'd be nice to be in the same room. And since I was planning this trip anyway, it kind of all worked out.
That's good.
Here we are.
And you found it. Okay.
I had trouble getting into the building, but I found it.
That's
why I've never went to Princeton. So.
No, that's one of the first. Getting in the door is one of the first tests that they do.
You have to be able to get in the door.
Now I had a bottle of water here too, but oh well.
No worries. Well, don't let me hold you back. I mean, you've waited a long time for this moment. We're setting up this interview, so please take it away, Amanda.
Sure. Okay. Wonderful. So this is also the first time I've ever interviewed anybody, so I've been very nervous about coming up with questions and sort of.
Well, we could just talk.
Okay.
Where would you start?
So I think so as a songwriter, when especially in the last 5 or 10 years, I feel like so much of what I write about is just sort of the human experience, and I never know exactly what inspires me, but I think more and more, and I actually, so I dropped out of school when I was younger, and I did attempt to go back and get a degree in my mid-20s, and I went to UNCA, and I was going for a religious studies degree. I find, again, I said, I wasn't raised in a religious household, but I've always found it to be very fascinating. My grandmother was a Catholic. She just passed, and she, so I would learn about like the saints from her. I wear Saint Christopher that she gave me. So I always kind of had this interest, just because I see religion as just it's just always been such a driving force in humanity. I mean, the study of religion is the study of humanity.
And the study of culture. I mean, it's also how people have shaped particular attitudes and experiences and defined what's good and what's bad and what's allowed and what isn't, and how people are supposed to respond to things. I mean, I realize it shaped far more in my experience than I ever thought, because I wasn't religious and my family wasn't. They were ex-Protestants. So what does that have to do with Christianity? You wouldn't think it would have to do a lot, but I've found that it's part of the culture. In our social system, in our legal system, what people are talking about today in Congress.
Yeah,
it's all about that.
So, I mean, I guess one of my first questions was, why? So I would encourage everyone to read Why Religion, because it's a beautiful book. Whether whatever your particular faith or non-faith or whatever you believe in. And you explain in that book sort of what brought you to want to study religion. You describe seeing Billy Graham when you were 14, which is, I live right side of Montreat, so I'm, right there by Billy Graham country. And so, so I think I have the sense of sort of why religion, sort of for you from reading the book, but also I guess my question is why Christianity, and why Christianity is such a, I mean, in our culture, in Western culture, Christianity is so prevalent. I mean, does it kind of come down to the money? Is it kind of like the New York Yankees? It's just like,
I mean, it's the most,
it's
I would say
just
most
so
widespread.
It's so widespread
tradition in the world.
And why? I mean, what makes a religion really fly? Because there's so many that didn't really make it, or that fizzle out, or
Yes, you're right. But let's go back before that. I mean, why study religion? I mean, I wrote in the book about the person I was going out with thought I was really crazy. Like, how do you do that? And his colleagues thought more so, because I mean, they were theoretical physicists. I mean, what did they know? So they thought, well, what does it mean to study religion? You must be some overgrown Sunday school teacher, or you just never got over it, or whatever, never grew up, is what they meant. Because they don't understand that it's not the same thing as being a clergy person, or wanting to be a minister or anything like that. This is a way of inquiring about how your own views are shaped, and how the culture puts pressure on people or not in various different ways, what it encourages and what it doesn't. So I was brought up like you, without, my family wasn't religious. My father had given it all up for Darwin, and he had been in a particularly ferocious kind of Presbyterian family where they argued about hell a lot, and he hated that. So he said, oh, I'm done. As soon as he found out about science, he said, these are silly old folk tales. Who needs that? Only stupid people. I mean, he didn't say that, but it was pretty clear that anybody with half a brain would have nothing to do with it. And that was certainly his view. And so the idea that I would look at it as a cultural phenomenon was a surprise. But I fell into it, as you said, Amanda. I was taken to a Billy Graham crusade when I didn't know who this man was. I was 14 and I was bored one afternoon in a small town with nothing going on. And I was invited to go to San Francisco and a lot going on. So I went. And it was very powerful. It was emotionally very powerful. He talked about America in ways that my immigrant grandparents on both sides this was the greatest country in the world, right? And the most moral and the most righteous and the gold standard for everything good.
Mhm.
It's what they taught. And I sort of imbibe that patriotism and I share it to some extent. I love this country in some ways. But we were just becoming aware of the Vietnam War that was very different from the way it was publicized. Growing up in California, I didn't know anything about racism, really. Just about zero.
Yeah.
And we found out that people were being beaten and killed and put in jail for trying to end segregation. And things were happening in this country that was awful. We had a president who said he wasn't a crook, but he was. That was Richard Nixon from my home state of California. So I fell into this evangelical group. And then I wrote about how I fell out of it.
Mhm. And that had to do with the loss of a friend, where you had a friend who was killed in a car accident.
Yes. I joined this evangelical group for a year, and it was very intense and very powerful. Everyone's together praying to Jesus and all brothers and sisters in Christ. And it was all kind of a group when you're 14 or 15. But as Amanda knows, when one of my friends was killed in an automobile accident one night after he was with somebody driving too fast and the car slipped, and he was 16 and he was suddenly dead. And I went back to my evangelical group, just shattered. This very vivid life. He had dropped out of school to paint. He was a painter. He was a brilliant person. He was 16 and his father thought he was crazy. Tried to put him in a mental hospital. And the psychiatrist said, just let him paint. But anyway, that happened. And I went back to the group and I said, my friend was just killed in an accident. They said, that's terrible. Was he born again? And I said, no, he was Jewish. And they said, well, then he's in hell. And I just felt like I was socked in the stomach. So I was utterly stunned. And I walked out of there. I never went back. It's just like, I thought this stuff was about love.
Mhm.
But some of it wasn't.
Yeah. Well, and that's a really interesting thing that I find, because, I think part of what drew me to want to study religion is that, it can be about love. And it seems like at the root of it, if we want to get very, I'm not a religious studies scholar, so I have to be careful not to get out of my depth here, but
No, say whatever.
it does seem that, it gets very wrapped up in politics. And, it seems like at the source, religion is something that people have always needed to some extent. And whatever that looks like, there's another question that I want to get to, but, back sort of, you go back hundreds and thousands of years, and it's a lot more sort of, it seems like the things that people were ready to believe, now that we have, so much science and sort of, we rely on science for a lot more, people are going to be more skeptical. If somebody, says, I saw God in a vision and this is what they told me I had to do. And, people are going to be like, well, are you nuts? Whereas at a different time, when our understanding of science was not what it is today, and when suffering was much greater because just survival was more of an everyday gamble, it was something that humans really had to have to sort of structure their lives and make sense of
It is that, but we talk about what people believe, and there are religious traditions, as you said, in every culture. We talk about, what do Muslims believe? What do Buddhists believe? What do Jews believe? It's the wrong paradigm in many ways, because it's based on Christianity, which set up a set of beliefs in the 4th century. So people where this is a dominant religion always assume that religions are a bunch of beliefs. But actually, for for most cultures, they're the way our people live. You know, they're how we eat. It's what we eat. Do we eat animals? Do we eat vegetables? Which animals can't we not eat? I mean, I'm thinking of dietary laws in Hinduism and Judaism and stuff like that. It's about who are your relatives? How do we count parents, relatives, brothers, sisters, cousins? Who's included in the kinship group? Who can you marry within a culture? All the questions anthropologists ask. Right? What happens when we die? Do we bury the dead? Do we burn them? Do we throw their bodies out in a dustbin? You know, what the culture does, that's the religious traditions. If you talk to like native tribes or Orthodox Jews or Hindus or Buddhists, it's not about a bunch of beliefs as much. So I began to realize this when I was in East Africa. And my husband and I were traveling to visit some friends there. And the host was from the Dinka tribe in southern Sudan. And he gave me a book of creation stories of the Dinka people. They're the people who live way down south. And he's a member of the Dinka tribe. And when he was in England, he wrote about the Dinka stories of his people and how they understood the world, because he knew the British had no clue of how they did. And so I learned from him, it was not about a bunch of beliefs, but about what's right in our culture, what kind of sexual practices, what kind of marital practices, what work women do, what work men do. That's all in Genesis. It's all about what men do, what women do, what marriages are legitimate, what sexuality is for. They're basic questions.
So it's kind of, it sets up society. It helps people live together, because if you're sort of, I'm imagining here, if you're, you know, again, if you're sort of in an environment where survival is harder to come by, it helps to stick together. It helps to have a cohesive society. And if everyone, it's kind of like traffic laws, right? Everyone has to obey the traffic light, or there's going to be.
But I think life is always hard to come by. Even for people like us who have so many advantages over most of the people who've ever lived in the world, right?
Right. And that's the, you know, that was a question that I sort of had an order here, but we're just going to go. You know, so there seems to be this question of, you know, why do bad things happen to good people? Why, you know, if you do all the things that you're supposed to do in the religion or just the societal order, how can something terrible happen to you or to somebody innocent like a child? You know, how can we how do we make sense of that? And it does seem that, you know, that is something that people that have a religious practice or religious group, it seems like that's something that is accounted for, maybe. But it's also interesting to me because it seems that I was thinking about, you know, in the song Amazing Grace, I think what is the line? It says, "'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and with grace my fears relieved." So it's this really interesting idea of like, so if, you know, if we have a God that set up the universe, you know, God is sort of responsible for the pain and suffering, but then also the relief is in God.
Well, not everywhere. It just depends what kind of God.
Right.
If you set it up the way the Hebrew Bible sets it up, and you have a God and you say, well, God is all powerful and is good. He's just, and he's good, and he can do anything. Then you have a problem. You say bad things happening to good people. Well, there's birth and there's death, right? So what's good and what's bad? I mean, death may not be bad under some circumstances. But if God is all powerful and all good, and something terrible happens to someone you love, right? You've set it up that something is wrong with you or with God.
Mhm.
But and the Bible says you can't blame him. We sinned. I mean, nobody would die according to Genesis.
Right.
Nobody would die if somebody hadn't done something terribly wrong. Now, this is, do you believe that? I don't believe that. I mean, I believe death is as
Biology.
organic and natural as the Stoics would say. You know, Marcus Aurelius, who's many of whose children died very young, said, death is as natural as birth. It's not good or bad. It's just the way life is. But he didn't have a God who set it all up that way.
Mm.
If you have the Greek gods, you know, Aphrodite, for example, if you read Homer, she can make you very beautiful, like Helen of Troy, so beautiful that, you know, people will fight a war for the beauty of this woman,
Mhm.
supposedly. But Aphrodite can turn on you. She can destroy you. She can get very mad. And it doesn't matter if you're her favorite Helen of Troy. In the Iliad, she's about to destroy Helen.
Mhm.
You don't do what I tell you, I'm going to kill you. She says, physically. And the gods are like that. They're like the sun. You need it to survive. It can kill you. They're like water, which we need to survive, but it can drown you. They're like the weather. Sometimes they're good and sometimes they're bad. You don't have a problem with bad things happening because that just happens.
Mhm.
But if you say God is good and he could do anything, you set it up that, then you have a problem. That's what I realized when I was writing about this, that the Hebrew Bible sets it up, that if something happens to you that is unfortunate and devastating, as happens to most of us, it's your fault. You did something wrong. That's completely a construct of our culture. I don't mean grief is, because grief is known to anyone who's ever lost someone they love, which is everyone. But not everybody interprets it as a punishment. It's just seen as part of nature. So it's our culture that has set it up to create guilt when it happens. We talk about survivor's guilt. In some Buddhist cultures, as far as I understand, if somebody dies at the age of 40 unexpectedly, they say, well, that's that person's karma. That's what person came into the world with. That's as much energy as that person had in this lifetime and then goes on to another lifetime.
Mhm.
That's how it works.
Mhm.
That's just like you plant some seeds and some of them grow and some of them don't. That's just nature.
Yeah.
There's no blame.
Right. So I wonder too, with the way, you know, we talk about kind of setting, you know, the way that a religion such as Christianity can be set up to sort of, you know, it might give structure that is really necessary. It can also maybe cause undue pain just through sort of having very strict. So maybe something as we change, you know, so we don't face, like you were saying, we don't face the same, I mean, you know, not that there's no suffering and terrible things still happen, you know, we can never change that, but just like, you know, we're not being chased by lions every day. That's something that, you know, unless somebody escapes from the zoo, that's not really something that we worry about.
But I do think that the way we experience loss, for example, when I was writing about it, I realized that, you know, people feel guilty when someone they love dies. And we call it survivor's guilt. We're so used to it. Because we take it, our culture has taught us that it's punishment. And you don't have to be religious. You don't have to be Jewish or Christian. It's just built into the culture. That the way shame is built into the culture by the story of Adam and Eve, or the idea that men are superior to women and rightly should rule over them. That's in Genesis too. So all of those cultural messages are things that you think nobody's listening to anymore, but they've become part of the culture, part of our legal system.
Right. It's just kind of baked in.
Yeah, like attitudes about sexuality. There's only one normal kind of sexuality. That's in Genesis also,
Mhm.
because all sexual acts are for procreation.
Mhm.
So we have a professor at Princeton who wrote the Defense of Marriage Act for George W. Bush.
Oh,
And he's channeling the Catholic Council of Bishops, Professor Robbie George in politics. He's a Catholic. And he basically says marriage has to be between one and woman because it's all about procreation. And you have to have the sexual equipment, even if you never have children, even if you're too old to, even if you have no intention, it's all about that. And that's also set up in this culture that way.
so why do you think some people are still sort of clinging to that when it, you could say easily make the argument, well, we're sort of overpopulated. There's a lot of people in the world. We're not so concerned with,
Yes.
we're making plenty more people, why is it anybody's business what, two consenting adults do? Like, why do we still have these sort of
I think these
hangovers?
things are deeply in the culture, and that, the way we look at them, they're certainly baked into British and American legal codes, for example.
Mhm.
So the study of religion, I really feel my job is, first of all, I'm not here to be a teacher of religion or tell you how great it is. I'm exploring how it affects us, right? Psychologically, socially, politically, for better and for worse. And it does both. I think it has a huge role in human culture. I was just talking last night to a friend who's brought up in Iran in Muslim culture. And she said, I'm not a Muslim, but her attitudes about being a woman are deeply shaped by being a Muslim.
Hmm.
And you have to cover the hair because it's inciting men to lust and so forth.
Mhm.
Those things she can't escape,
Mhm.
except she came to America to escape.
Yeah.
But if she were in Iran, she can't escape it. Not in Afghanistan, not in many parts of the world,
Yeah.
because that's so much part of that culture.
So I wonder, sort of almost to play devil's advocate, well, not exactly, since it's not the direction that the conversation has been taking, but just, so if we have sort of these, so to say, that, okay, so this was all for a reason, like let's say the reason that people needed sort of this structure was to band us together and have the safety in numbers and society. How would it have been different? So the Gospel of Thomas, for example, that you write about in Beyond Belief, it seems to be, it's much more. Could you talk just a little bit about the difference between, like, what is mysticism in religion?
Okay, sure. I mean, this is really interesting. I got interested in the history of Christianity because I got very captivated by this evangelical preacher. And then I left that group and went off and just abandoned the whole thing for 5 years. And then thought something about that experience was very powerful and positive. It opened up my imagination in many ways. I felt like I'd been living on a flat earth when I was told there's nothing in the world except what you can prove empirically. It's too narrow a world. So what is it that I was missing? And I went back to find out, what do we know about the beginning of the Christian movement, how it started? Why would anybody believe this stuff anyway? And suddenly, our team of graduate students at Harvard had a sort of elephant fall on our heads in the form of a huge gift from 2,000 years ago, a find of 51 ancient books. 51 ancient books. This is one volume out of 5. Got them right here. Oh, I've got 5 of them. These are Coptic texts. And these ancient books include at
The weight
least
of them.
5 gospels about Jesus and his disciples, which I'd never heard of. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Peter. Wait a minute. Where were these? Well, as I said, they were written in those early centuries. but they were censored by what became the bishops of the Catholic Church when the movement turned into an institution and allied with the Roman Empire.
Right.
So then, as you said, you need structure, you need changes to the legal code, you need all kinds of things. It becomes a political as well as a religious institution, which allegedly gives meaning to your life, but it also gives you a whole set of rules.
Right. And do you think, so I wonder, so this is the mysticism is more sort of internal, it's more about your knowledge of God or your relationship with God.
But what they did was leave out a whole lot of stuff that wasn't useful for building an institution.
Right.
Which you're calling mysticism, which has to do with certain kinds of elusive religious experience, spiritual experience, intuitions, visions, dreams, synchronicities, who knows?
Right.
All kinds of mysteries. And those traditions were excluded because they're very private to you or me. Right?
So if those hadn't been excluded, if that had been, I mean, do you think that there was a reason? Do you think that, I mean, how do you think humanity would have looked different? How do you think the sort of the progression of, if it hadn't just been, okay, this is what is going into the creed, this is what we're going with here. If it had been more sort of a personal, individualized experience, how do you think we'd be different today?
It would be much wider open, much more available to your experience. The three of us have very different lives, right? And very different experiences. And we wouldn't have the cohesiveness of a single cultural story, which we do, even though we're quite disparate, in place and time. But I also think it would have more powerful kinds of personal experience validated. Because I don't think religion is about a bunch of beliefs. Those are set up in the creed and they're written down, and you have to believe that if you're Orthodox. And that word means straight thinking. Orthodoxa. I always think it's like orthodontia, which means straight teeth, right? Orthodoxa is straight ideas. And the bishops are all for straight ideas, which are their ideas. You can't have your ideas. You can't say, I had a dream and this is how it seems to me.
Right. So nobody can say that now.
So
there's not going to be another Jesus.
Interpretation.
If there's another Jesus, it's
another Jesus. He won't be the right one.
He won't be the right.
No, he's out.
All right.
The role has been taken.
Gotcha.
So the Catholic Church has claimed to be the only institution granting salvation in the world, right? And that's how it became very powerful and still is.
Yeah.
But these texts really, Amanda, they open up your experience. They're more like poems.
Is it the Dead Sea Scrolls, or
no,
is it different?
they're close. They were found exactly the same year as the Dead Sea Scrolls. That was 1945. These were found, Dead Sea Scrolls were found in Israel, right? As the library of a long lost Jewish group called the Essenes, which means the Holy Ones. They were living in a community, a kind of monastic community, trying to live a holy life, sort of a precursor of monasticism. And these texts were found actually, Jack, the same year in Upper Egypt, buried in a cave because the bishops had said, burn those. They took all these texts written in Greek, like the New Testament, and they piled them up and burned them and destroyed them and censored them completely because they would open something to your interpretation or mine. And so that's why these institutions close off your experience. They tell you it doesn't matter, or you are guilty, or you're a sinner. And we'll forgive you, but you have to go through the right rituals.
Right.
And we'll be the authorities to tell you how to do that.
Right.
Did I hear that they also in the 4th century took out reincarnation from the Bible?
They did. And it wasn't in the Bible so much, but it was in the writings of the most brilliant Christian thinker of the time. He was an Egyptian. His name is Origen, he was living in Egypt, the 2nd and 3rd century, when these texts were being read, and he read this stuff. And he had an amazing imagination. He's one of the great fathers of the church. But 500 years after he died, he was declared a heretic by the Catholic Church for saying that he thought that even the devil could find his way back to God, because God created everything. And the devil was, after all, an angel in the beginning. But yes, that's what happened.
Obviously, you get more control over it. Easy to leave your money to the church if you know you're not coming back.
That's
Well, I
Excellent
hadn't
point.
thought of that, but that's interesting. I was talking to people who were Catholic monastics who said that if you were to devote yourself to the church and you had money and you didn't have family to pass your property down to, it would go to the church. And he thought that was an important factor. But yes, reincarnation is one of many ways of perceiving and thinking that was shut off deliberately. And what you call mysticism. I mean, these texts talk about dreams. They say that Jesus not only taught publicly what's in the Gospel of the New Testament, but he also taught secretly to certain disciples. And he told them things that he didn't tell the others because the others weren't ready for it. And the Gospel of Thomas, found in this collection, claims to say these are the secret teachings of the living Jesus. And the disciple Judas Thomas wrote them down. The Gospel of Mary claims that Jesus said certain things to Mary that were secret, and she was a disciple who learned things he didn't tell Peter, and Peter got very angry and said, "You wouldn't talk to a woman and talk to us. Are you serious?" And in the Gospel of Mary, she wins the argument. So that is one of the censored books.
That had to go.
Oh, gosh.
It was found in Ethiopic, translated into Syriac and Coptic and Old Russian and Hebrew and Aramaic and Greek, hundreds of languages at the time. But it only survives in a fragment in Ethiopia, in Ethiopic, where Mary Magdalene is revered as a great disciple. If you go to, you've been to Israel? Jack?
No, never.
Well, if you go to the Mount of Olives, where Jesus spent the night before he died, there's a beautiful church, one of the most beautiful I've ever seen, the Church of St. Mary of Magdala. It's a Russian Orthodox church with gold and blue. It's just brilliant. But there she's a holy saint. And these traditions about her are revered, but they're rejected in the Catholic Church that said she was a prostitute.
Right. And so was that, do you think it was purely because she was female?
It's probably, we think it's because there were women who claimed to have the same authority in the churches as men. And some of the men didn't think that was a good idea. So they fought this battle out on the question of whether Jesus would allow his disciples to be women. And the people in favor of that said, well, Mary Magdalene was a very important disciple. And Pope Leo in the 4th century, I believe, said, no, she was the prostitute who washed Jesus's feet with her hair and repented. And she was demon possessed. She was a dreadful woman. She's a whore. So she gets this reputation in the West, and painters are able to make portraits of her that are either enormously sensual, because you can't do these sort of sensual half-naked women if they're not a prostitute like Mary Magdalene, or a penitent who looks like she's, totally destroyed. I mean, that's the image of women that is more suitable for the society that was set up for a couple thousand years. So it's not just about Peter and Mary Magdalene. It's about how women are seen and how men are seen. For example, that's one example.
But I guess there were some victories. Like, imagine if it was, you could have more than one wife if Jesus had gone down that road, or a Catholic Church. I mean, people like Trump or Clinton would have had harems, wouldn't they? And then you'd have all these young men who had no partners going off to fight wars, and
Yeah.
having all this pent up energy and
Well, it's funny, Jack, but our professor here, who wrote the Defense of Marriage Act, basically says marriage must be between one man and one woman. And he was in my class, and I said, actually, that's not what the Bible says. And he said, "What?" And I said, well, it's in the Hebrew Bible, it's one man and one woman. And it's really one man it's one man and his woman. It's one man and as many women as he can afford, because women were property like cattle. And if you were wealthy and like David, you could have several. If you were Solomon, you might have 1,000. So polygamy is the rule in ancient Israel.
oh, really?
And it's completely legal, depending on the fact, can you afford it? If you can afford 4 households, yes, or 1,000. But at the time of Jesus, some Jews were thinking about monogamy because actually Greeks and Egyptians and Romans were monogamous, and they looked askance at polygamy.
Mhm.
So some Jewish groups and the followers of Jesus living in the Western cultures followed the pattern of monogamy. But that's another example of the way the society shapes you.
Yeah.
So that's sort of the link here, because I wanted to ask too about sort of, I know you've written a little bit about sort of your own quest of asking about, religious experience versus insanity, like how do we distinguish that? And something that's always struck me as an interesting story is the beginning of Mormonism, kind of looking into a hat and saying, I know the answers, whatever. I am ignorant in the exact way that happened, but and that's just a more modern example. I mean, that we're talking, I can't remember what year that was, but it was not, thousands of years ago. So like how does that kind of take off,
I think you're totally right. I mean, when people say Mormonism is, these people have really weird ideas. I thought, have you looked at early Christians?
But somehow that's legitimate. Right? It's almost like it's like grandfathered in, right? Because it's so old.
But I've really come to the conviction. I'm very much interested in the psychology of religion and the sociology and politics. And I really believe that the psychologist William James, who was, a brother of Henry James, his book?
I read
Varieties of
pieces of it when
Religious-
I was at school. Yeah.
Varieties of Religious Experience. He wrote it in 1912. It was a series of lectures he delivered at the University of Edinburgh. And he basically said, what we're missing in most Christianity, and Christianity was all he knew, is what the experiences people have of sometimes having a strange dream or encountering God or having a vision or something that doesn't really fit our scientific paradigm. But he said people actually have those experiences. And my colleague at Stanford, Tanya Luhrmann, wrote a brilliant book called How God Becomes Real.
I have a note. I heard you talk about
And
that.
what she shows, Tanya's not religious herself. She's a secular Jew who got interested in religion because some of her family got into evangelical Christianity. And it is a very interesting subject in anthropology. So she began to realize that anthropology is not about a bunch of beliefs, it's about ways of life. It's about the way you walk and the way you sing and the way you move and with whom and how. And those are practices like those that Orthodox Jews do, or those that evangelical Christians do, those that Buddhists do with meditation and fasting and prayer. Those get you into different states of experience. Like if you don't sleep for 3 days, you get very susceptible to the imagination. And James shows, and I think he's right, and Tanya agrees, I think so too, that what gives rise to religious imagination is also what gives rise to very odd states of being. So it's almost on a continuum with brilliance, imagination, creative achievement, and insanity at the same time. It's on a continuum. And it's very hard to know where those stop and start. And so it's kind of explosive, this kind of energy, these kinds of explorations. And people are suspicious of it for reasons, because I was just reading about a group of Americans who went off to India to create perfect society, an ashram with Sri Aurobindo, and ended up dying horrible deaths because they refused any medical treatment, and they kept believing they could overcome death if they just tried hard enough. And they tried harder than anyone can imagine, and the results were horrible, horrible. And I thought the first rule in religion should be, like it is for medicine, first do no harm. But this was one that harmed a whole lot of people, and a lot of things do that.
Yeah.
Religions can be powerful in war because they create such strong feelings. I was working on the book of Revelation because a president 20 years ago started a war in Iraq
That's 20 years
on the
ago.
basis of the book of Revelation. And he persuaded his listeners, evangelical Christians, that American bombs were delivering the wrath of God that was predicted in the book of Revelation. And I was so like, are you out of your mind? So yeah, well, I couldn't ask him that. How do you do that with the book of Revelation? This is written 2,000 years ago. It's not about Iraq and American oil.
Probably little to do with
Sure, that's not in there. No, not.
Even shock and awe
right.
is about American bombs over Baghdad, which happens to be Babylon, Israel's ancient enemy. And the book of Revelation talks about how God is destroying Babylon with brilliant light and explosions of sound louder than anything, and people on earth crying for God. And people in that group were reading this as the bombs of Americans killing Iraqis. And I wrote that book because I wanted to figure out, how do you do that? And the book itself lends itself to that. So I'm just saying, many people have sort of gone aground on the book of Revelation. Many groups.
Why do you think that's in there? Why is Revelation in the Bible?
Because it's a powerful visionary account. The visions are very strong. If you look at the art, I was also fascinated with the art that artists create, particularly William Blake, but countless artists. The art and the films that have come out of that are just extraordinary. That's what I mean by imagination, creative imagination, but also horrible things come out of it. So I wrote a book about the origin of Satan, which I thought was kind of an easy target because Satan's kind of a cartoon kind of guy, right? And I found out that actually the stories about Satan are the background of Christian anti-Semitism, and I didn't even know it.
Oh, wow.
And that's what that book is about. And I just thought, what?
Yeah.
I wasn't looking for that. But the story about how Jews killed Jesus is in
Who
that
was a
story.
Jew, right? Jesus was a Jew.
Jesus was a Jew, but the only people blamed for his death in Matthew's gospel are Jews and not Romans. And that's absolutely counter-historical. But it was necessary. Anyway, it's a whole story. But the point is, we have to understand the potential for greatness in these sources, and also for really getting you way off track,
So even though, I know that it was an argument, I know from reading your work that, it was an argument of sort of burying these texts, that maybe they were dangerous in that way. If people were interpreting things too much for themselves, then people could get out of line,
go off the rails.
mayhem, bedlam, yeah. But people use what's written to do horrendous
Well, that's
things.
perfectly true. And I do think there's this liability in religious traditions, it can lead people to terrible things, God told me to kill these people, whatever. I was visiting Stanford where Tanya Luhrmann is, and she set up a lunch for me with 12 psychiatrists. And so I said, okay, so if somebody comes to you and says, I have visions, do you assume the person is pathological, is delusional? And they sort of said, well, yeah. Well, I think people do have religious experiences. One of my good friends who's a poet wrote a poem about how the angel Gabriel appeared to Mary. Beautiful poem. She's a well-known poet. He said, how did you write that? Her name is Mary too. She said, well, I had an experience like that. She was raised Catholic. She said she had this experience of divine love coming to her. And it was a very beautiful moment. So she wrote this, but I couldn't say it was about me. And I said, well, why not? She said, what's the last taboo? But the other thing, Amanda and Jack, is that people do have what I call now experiences I can't explain. And I've had them too. Mm-hmm. Well, I didn't have them too long ago, but people have them with various help from other chemicals. And they lead into different kinds of experiences, sometimes very disturbing and sometimes absolutely glorious. So I think it's important to know that this is part of our human makeup, that we try to create meaning. And it's very important how we do that. And to be careful not to let other people tell us what it is.
Yeah, it's interesting how, I just, as we're sitting here talking, it just occurs to me, it's, there is sort of this taboo now of, you can't, because you would be crazy, if you, and even, we, me and my friends, it's kind of like, I feel like a lot of times before if I'm going to tell somebody like, oh, I have this feeling about something, or, I have this intuition, or I have this experience, I would preface it with like, this is a little woo woo, like we kind of have these sort of, many of us, obviously not everybody, but many people sort of have, religion has kind of become this, I can't think of the word, but
it's a sense of delusion, right?
Well,
or something.
And it's like you said, your father would say, it was kind of, it's almost associated with, people who are too ignorant to
Either
turn to
ignorant or
science.
just a little unbalanced
or a little
emotion.
crazy, right? And I, and I'd like to, because I don't want to, it's easy to sort of get into all of the negative things that have come out of religion, but clearly there's been a lot of beauty and good, and I do think that ultimately it's something that gives a lot of people comfort and
Oh, yes.
purpose.
Yes.
So I wonder now, like, do you think, are we moving into a time where religion, whatever that looks like, is a little bit more of an internal experience, or as it seems to me that it's sort of, church has become more of sort of a, I know plenty of people that go to church, but it's certainly not something that everybody does anymore, right?
Well, many, many more people now, like you, your grandmother was Catholic and quite seriously devout, I would say, in some ways. And you're not doing that. I think that is, many people are wanting to get in touch with their own authentic experience and not be told how they're supposed to react or feel or act or behave in the ways that those institutions do teach.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that they also can make people feel very guilty for things for which they're not guilty. Like the loss of someone close to them. That's something I had to write about, because when it happened to me, the death of my son when he was 6 years old, some really rare disease, I somehow felt it was my fault, that I couldn't fix him, I couldn't save him, we couldn't go to doctors anywhere in this country who could do anything. There was nothing to do. And And I felt like a terrible failure and felt guilty about it on top of it, because you're supposed to protect your child. And I realized, and I had to do this exploration to realize that in the Bible, there's a story about King David lusts for someone else's wife, and he goes and gets his attendants to take her when her husband's away and bring the woman to him, and he has sex with her, and she sends him a note and says, "I'm pregnant." And then he got very nervous and tried to get her husband to come back from the front lines so that it would look like his child, but it didn't happen. And then the Bible says the child died because of the sin of David and Bathsheba, because they weren't married, and because he raped her, basically. Now that's probably not why the child died, but the baby's death is a punishment because somebody did something very wrong. And I realized that's how this culture interprets that. And I was writing for other parents who had similar experience, because there are many families in this that I've even heard about who've never even mentioned things that happen in their family, like the loss of a child. I mean, it's just too much of a shame. It's shameful because they feel guilty, even though it has nothing to do with what they did. It's one thing to be ashamed if you kill somebody, but if you do everything you can to preserve someone's life and you can't, it's not your fault. But it still feels like it. And the culture tells you it is. And some cultures don't tell you that. But I had to do this because the burden of a sense of guilt on top of what people in the ancient world called unbearable grief, when half the children died before the age of 5. It happened to everybody practically.
Yeah.
Still, they said it was unbearable. And the Romans knew that. And they didn't blame anybody. They just knew it happens. Because there's a lot of diseases. There's a lot of things that go wrong.
And survival was hard.
But in our culture, it became something different. And I wanted to separate what seemed to me valid experience from burdens that we don't have to suffer, just by understanding that this has been sort of piled on us.
Yeah.
Just the way women, have been taught to be inferior, or how Black people have been taught that they're inferior. And no matter what they say today, many who say it most loudly still feel that way.
I mean, it is interesting to, I'm thinking of sort of this in my own experience, these extreme emotions that we can't help but feel.
Right.
I mean, it's almost, especially here, we live in a culture where extreme emotions are kind of frowned upon. It's maybe, and if not frowned upon, at least sort of like, keep that over there. It's like, and it's almost, you could almost classify it with a religious experience in the same way that we sort of say, well, that's, that's understandable, go to church on Sunday. But if the angel comes down and starts talking to you, then we're gonna lock you up, and it's sort of like, okay, well, have your grief, but I think people are very uncomfortable with just sitting with that and sitting with the extreme discomfort,
Of course,
that it brings for other people too, because none of us like to be reminded that we all walk closer to death than we'd like to imagine,
Well, we'd like to not. But also in these secret texts, there's a sense of openness to what I call experiences I can't explain, because now I've had some of those. And I went to a conference about experiences I can't explain with psychiatrists, with people who say they've had UFO experience, with
that's a great
with
tie-in.
Scholars of religion, with many other people who have had experiences that they can't explain. And I know they happen, and it's kind of part of the normal human experience. But I at least was taught that those things don't happen at all, or to avoid them. But this is part of who we are as people. It's also how we create meaning, And that's what I mean. It's about imagination. So it's often the most imaginative, artistic people who are most susceptible to those kinds of experiences. These texts, I was mentioning this beautiful Iranian woman I was with last night at a party, marvelous woman. She once wrote a poem in a kind of ecstatic state. And she sent me the poem. And I said, I can't believe this. This is so much like a poem 2,000 years ago in this collection.
Oh, wow.
You've seen the poem? It's called Thunder.
Oh, I
Complete
haven't
mind.
read the poem, but I read
Thunder,
about it.
complete mind. And it's about herself experiencing herself with all of her contradictions. Like thunder speaks as a divine energy that comes from God, a feminine energy in the universe, who is both good and evil, who is both war and peace, foolish and wise. She encompasses all the opposites, as we all do in many ways. She's not just good or bad at all. She's like energy, which is essential, and it can be deadly. It can be perfect. It can be wonderful.
So that, and it's interesting now, I feel that sort of the quest for self-acceptance has really become a major thing, and it's like kind of a hot topic right now. And just, sort of mental health talk. And I think there's a lot more awareness around mental health now, which is a great thing. But, just that seems to be the ever sort of the quest now. We sort of have moved from a society where everything is buttoned up. We don't like to look at ourselves or be different to, more of a society where everyone's like, okay, well, let's see where we're different. Let's try to embrace, and clearly there's still relics from the past, but, it seems like we're moving in that. Maybe we're moving into more of a.
I think what you were saying before too, that many people, myself included, are really not immersed in institutions the way people traditionally were. My parents were. You were either in a church or out of one. If you were Jewish, you're either practicing or not practicing. Many people are distancing themselves from those traditions in the kind of identification way, in order to find out who they are and their own experience more generally. And we have a global world, so you might connect with somebody from Indonesia in a way that neither of your cultures would anticipate. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's about your experience and that person's experience, which might be very unexpected. So I think that's wonderful. I mean, I think that's where we are. Sort of this idea that people will not say they believe in God or church, they don't go to churches. They're sort of done with that, because those are very conservative institutions right now. I love some things about them. I love the music. I love the Christmas carols, all of that stuff.
I love
cathedrals.
So in Italy, every time I've been in Italy, just being in beautiful old, these buildings that were built to,
to create a space that open to transcendence. And they do.
Yeah. I mean, you
And
walk in and
you're
you feel
talking about
something.
experience. You're talking about how you feel. And that's what they're built for. And they contain that in a safe space. It's not a wilderness where there are wolves out to bite you.
Right.
It's a safe space, and it's very powerful. So I think we need to be aware of those feelings that draw you into that, because I love that too. I can't stay out of that, but also the boundaries. How do we contain those experiences so we don't feel like we're crazy? Tanya Lorman is studying, as I said, people who have visions and voices, both in mental hospitals and in religious institutions, because they're not so different. But they are different, because some people are very troubled in those states, and other people may have experiences like that are actually very good for them. In the ancient world, they would ask a great saint like Saint Anthony, how do you know when you have a dream, whether it comes from God or from the devil? This is in the 2nd century where these texts come from. And he said, well, if it comes from the devil, it may amaze you at first, but when it leaves, it will leave you terrified and frightened and feeling anxious. But if it's from God, it may overwhelm you with fear at first, but when it leaves you, if it's an angel, it will leave you with a sense of peace. And the experiences he's talking about happen to us. Right? And we don't need that language necessarily, but just to recognize that there are different ways to engage the human capacity for what we call spiritual experience, which I can't avoid. I'm more susceptible to it than a lot of people. But how do you deal with it?
Yeah. Well, it almost seems if you can, it seems like it still comes back to sort of being able to be part of society. So it's like you can have the experience
Yes.
and go to work and, do, feed your kids, whatever you got to do, then that's okay. That's great. And maybe it's even worthy of a new religion, who knows? But if you cannot function in society, if you're walking down the street screaming at everybody, or if you do commit violence, then we got to put you away.
Well, yeah, and religion can do both. I mean, you can have violence in the name of God. You can have people trying to kill people and destroy a country in the name of God. You can have someone as steady and sane as Joe Biden, Catholic that he is, trying to do the right thing, trying to get health care for people who don't have it, trying to legalize the sexual activities of people who are not normal in the old-fashioned paradigm. He's trying to make the world better for people, and it comes out of his Catholic tradition. I have a great respect for that.
Well, this is so. Prior to starting to read your work, my knowledge of the New Testament was very slim. Like I said, I was not raised within any kind of religious tradition, and it's been interesting. It's almost like when I started watching Seinfeld much later in life,
Yes.
after it was, or its syndication, I was like, oh, this is what people are talking about. It really runs through, but so much of it is about feeding the hungry and healing the sick and loving your neighbor and being a good person is what a lot of it comes down to. And I think it is very surprising, when you read that, to think about some of the things that are done in the name of Christianity.
Well, and yes, and the Catholic Church is an example. I mean, the Protestants too. I mean, they burn people at the stake, Catholics and Protestants, each other. They burn Jews. They condemn people and make them ashamed of themselves.
Well, it's interesting too that
they give people blessings.
Right.
There's a lot of elements. That's why I mentioned our Catholic president, because I think he's embodying, as well as he can under the circumstances, some of the best aspects of that tradition.
Yeah. It seems so strange to me that, the Christians were persecuted for, pretty extremely for a while there. And then, as soon as, the Orthodox Church was created, it was like, and now we're going to sort of persecute,
Yes.
anyone who's a Christian that doesn't agree with us.
Exactly.
It's kind of a very about face.
They did. They destroyed all these texts, which are really a wonderful reservoir of showing us that we have a much wider range of what we think of as ancient culture and Christianity and all of that. It's much more mixed with Judaism. It's much more mixed with probably Indian traditions that come out of Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
This stuff was translated into Egyptian, into Coptic. These people went on journeys from Greece to India to find out the learning of the Hindus and bring it back. So there's a lot of mixed culture there, very much like the world we live in which people are aware of a very wide range of different cultures.
None of us live in a vacuum as much as we sometimes like to imagine that we do. It's
Yeah.
always, and there's never really been a vacuum. I mean, maybe in the very, very early days of humanity when people were just kind of roaming, but even then, nobody was staying in one place really. So you'd come across other groups, other
Yeah.
families, and
then the other question you raised about finding meaning, I was always very much influenced by a book that you may know this, Jack, the book, and you may know this, called Man's Search for Meaning. Do you know it?
I don't.
Oh, it's a brilliant book to be quite simple about it. And show you it's just 90 pages.
Huh?
It's written by a Jewish psychiatrist about what happened to him in the death camps of Auschwitz.
Oh, Victor Frank.
Victor
Yes.
Frankl.
Okay. Yes. I haven't read it.
Man's Search for Meaning.
Yes.
And he wrote
Yeah.
90 pages. And he didn't have any religious beliefs particularly, but he had a vision of his wife who was in the camp. He didn't know if she was alive or dead. She died there actually. And it didn't matter to him because it was the sense of love he had for her that got him through.
Wow.
And he talks about that and he says, how do people survive unimaginable horror, especially humanly inflicted things? Horrible. He said the only way they survive is if they have a sense of some meaning that gets them through. And he said it doesn't matter what it is, it can be very personal to you. It doesn't have to be religious per se. It can be an obligation you have to a family member to take them through an illness or something like that. It can be making the world better. It's just like those people. I think, for example, of those high school students who in Florida, so many others too, who saw their classmates being shot to death in front of them. And they didn't just go crazy. They didn't just scream and yell, which they had to do surely as well. They're trying to stop crazy infatuation Americans have with guns in order to spare other people the horror that they went through. So that's finding meaning, he said, in a terrible event.
Yeah.
People will try to take that very event, and that's what I tried to do with my own experience, is to write about it in a way that it might be maybe useful. Useful.
And I was going to say, I do, and I have found it very useful. And I do think, when Jack asked me to do this podcast, the language was, she's a hero to interview. And, I think I just never think in those terms. So I didn't really have a hero ready to think about. And I sort of went to the very, what we kind of tend to think about as heroes, people, firefighters and, sort of the 9/11 heroes and people who are fighting, to solve world hunger. And I was introduced to your book this summer, just through some personal circumstances. And, I find your writing heroic because I think you've written about some personal experiences that I think you describe in your book like being burned alive. And I imagine
Yes.
that is exactly.
Yeah, that just. Yeah. And what you said is it could be those certain kinds of experiences, the way we interpret them and take them on as if we were somehow at fault. You said it can be a cancer on the soul. And I thought that was very touching because I thought there are harms done to people's souls. And religious institutions have done that. And they've also helped heal them.
Yeah.
So we need to discriminate. It's not one thing or the other. It's these traditions are a necessary part of every society. But there are elements that harm people, and there are elements that nurture people. And I think it's our job to sort those out.
Yeah. And, I think that through, both just sort of bringing these ancient texts that, didn't get a lot of spotlight, by bringing them into the spotlight, you're helping a lot of people. And I think also just by writing about your personal experience, I think that's such a brave thing to do. And I read a quote from you in another interview where I can't remember what the question was exactly, but it was, saying something about how you have been heroic, and
I didn't say.
no, you didn't, you wrote, but I think your response to it was that, walking through grief is heroic.
Well, I
to
had
just-
2 children to raise, and I just thought I can't just fall apart now. Because I have
and
2
it's
very small
very
people
small, very young.
who are depending on me. My husband had died too, so that was, I don't imagine, I don't remember, I don't know how I did it, but I did it because those little children needed someone there.
And you were a hero for them.
Well,
I mean, and just even if you hadn't had them to watch, and just I think just I've also been reading this book. No, I can't remember the author's name, but it has to do with a lot of Greek myths and sort of and actually women in Greek myth and sort of the way that they've been misportrayed perhaps. But I don't know if that's a word. But I've been thinking a lot about Greek heroes, and just sort of I wonder if some of those myths, they come out of this very human suffering that we all experience. We're all touched by it. Even we hope that we never will be, but most of us are. And we kind of come up with these stories of people who walked through hell, or fought monsters, and it mirrors our experience, our very human experience.
and fought monsters and come out with a kind of heroism. Viktor Frankl did that, and those Parkland school children did that, and many other people who see terrible injustice done are working to change it and working to transform.
And to keep building rather than,
Absolutely.
because I think a common feeling in grief is that everything is falling apart and falling down, and to kind of have the strength to keep moving forward for your children, for your loved ones, for humanity, that's kind of
Right.
what that's how we move forward as a group, as a species,
As a species, Yeah.
And it makes me think of a quote that I know that you love, and I've really come to love too, which is from the Gospel of Thomas. I think
yes.
you know what I'm talking about. You'll say it better than me, but about bringing forth what is within you.
This is, Jack, I don't know if you know, but in the Gospel of Thomas, it claims to be the secret teaching of Jesus. And half of this little text, it's only 14 pages, is just the same as anything we find in the New Testament. And half of it is different. So some of the sayings are different. And when I came across a saying in that collection, Jesus said, if you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. And I thought, oh, it just happens to be true. I mean, you have to believe it. It's true. And you can bring forth things you couldn't imagine that you could live through. Right? That's surprising.
Yeah.
And people live through all kinds of things. I mean, I'm very much aware because I've never had the experience of dealing with violence in any personal way. I can't imagine how people in Ukraine are being shot at and dealing with horrible things being done to people intentionally.
Yeah.
Intentionally. I think it's bad enough what happens to us unintentionally, but to have people intentionally inflict harm, it is, I mean, you think it would just make you enraged, And it does, but it also, some people can respond to that in a way that that is harmful, and some people respond to it in a way that is heroic and often helps other people in powerful ways.
Yeah. There was another book that I read this year. Who now? If I can't remember this guy's name, I'm going to be angry with myself. But the book is called Humankind. He's a
I've heard of it.
Dutch. He's a Dutch.
He wrote to you. What is? I haven't seen it.
Well, it's basically. I found this guy because there's a great clip of him arguing with I think Tucker Carlson or somebody about just like, how taxing, not increasing taxes on the rich is sort of a ridiculous thing. But so he's very brilliant, and I hope his name will come to me. But this book, Humankind, is sort of making the argument, and I find it interesting because he wrote it before the pandemic, before the war in Ukraine, but certainly not before a lot of horrible things in humanity happened. And his argument is that we sort of, it's kind of the negativity bias where we tend to focus on, negative news stories and the horrible things that people do. But really on a whole, human beings are good. And a lot of the things that go underreported are when horrible things happen, the way that neighbors come together and the way that people lift each other up and save one another and
Absolutely
celebrate one another. And he says that the kind of the origin of humanity, the way that Homo sapiens sort of ended up being the whatever humanoid that outlasted all the other ones, is that we were kinder. We sort of had the ability to form relationships. It wasn't all
positive social bonds.
Right.
I mean, this is countering the Darwinian narratives that I grew up with, which is we're all fighting to survive and we're killing each other off so that we can have each other's territory.
Right.
Or food or whatever it is. And the other story is it's about collaboration, society. You've talked a lot today about creating societies, what fosters connection and well-being and joy.
Yeah, joy is a word that I've thought a lot about, and that I know you mentioned that too, just sort of finding the capacity for joy, to, especially after walking through something that is just, it seems like the unbearable
never
loss.
be happy again, but actually things transform sometimes.
Yeah. And I'm so glad that I got to meet you and interview you on a very happy day. You're celebrating the new marriage.
Yes, isn't that amazing? After I wrote about a lot of loss of my wonderful husband, that was decades ago, and other losses, and now just found somebody that I had known in high school, and we just got married. We were at a party last night, people celebrating and dancing, having a marvelous, making music.
Yeah. And it is kind of all this human experience, it's just a very crazy, it's just crazy the different sides of the spectrum that we find ourselves on.
Well, they are extreme. They are extreme. If you read William James again, it's a very good book.
Yeah, I want it,
They're
when
extreme.
I heard you mention in an interview, and obviously mentioned again today, and I was thinking I really need to, because when I was kind of just trying to get through it, I think.
You don't have to read the whole thing. I keep stopping when he gets to St. Louis because I find them kind of weird.
Oh,
I think I'm brought up a little too Protestant to appreciate St. Teresa. But when the opening part's about the reality of the unseen, and he's countering Freud, who basically says religion is a delusion. It's only for children who are afraid of the dark, and they have to create a big daddy and mommy up in the sky, actually just a daddy, to make everything okay. And they have to have this little pretend between them and their imaginary person up there. Well, okay. I mean, there's some truth in that. Psychological compensation. That's not the whole story. That's not the sum of religious experience at all. There's a lot of joy. There's a lot of celebration.
Yeah. And it almost seems that, that maybe is the way that, whatever religion looks like to a person, I can almost say I feel like it's the definition of it is sort of whatever helps you to be able to find joy, because it's almost the way that we bargain. It's like, okay, well, if I'm gonna have to know that the terrible things are possible, because none of us get a guarantee, right? We never know what's going to happen. It's almost, religion is almost, and again, I'm not talking about any one particular religion or any sort of, the beliefs, but just what we find that gives us joy, that gives us that capability to keep walking and smile again, and to experience the other side of the spectrum, even though we know how close we could be.
Oh yeah, and we always are. Yes.
Yeah.
Tolstoy also wrote a wonderful biography called The Confession.
Oh yeah, I've never read Tolstoy. There's a lot of
he writes.
You're getting a reading list today.
I
he writes very long books. This one is only about 90 pages. Too.
Okay, 90 pages I can do.
It's interesting. It's about his own sort of crisis in his life when he felt suicidal and depressed, and came out of it by a sense of longing for God. And even my friend, the anthropologist at Stanford, said, well, okay, I'm secular and Jewish, but and I called her up and I said, Tanya, I love your book. And she said, well, it's the difference between an anthropologist who's looking for God and someone who thinks that old people who do that are crazy. And she's the first kind.
Yeah.
So, there's just a lot of wonderful things to explore.
There are a lot of wonderful things to explore in the world.
And relationships to have. I think that for me is what becomes the most important thing, is the way we can connect with other people. And that book is one way of doing that, with experience that I couldn't otherwise share. And I sort of thought maybe this is just a therapeutic thing, but I have to write it. And then after I wrote it, I said, why not? I mean, it doesn't make me look good, but it's just what really
It doesn't make you look bad.
well, it's yeah, but you
and I love, because I think in the final, I just reread the last chapter of it last night actually, and and you do talk about how connection, we find sometimes, these terrible things that happen that we feel like we can't live it through, those are what help us to connect to other people.
Yes, I mean, I felt, as I said, in a moment of real anguish, that vision of connection with all other beings. And there's so much also, Jack, in these texts, which is about how connected we are with all humans, with all beings, the way Buddhist teaching speaks about compassion for all living beings. That kind of connectedness with nature and the rest of our species and any other species, it seems to me is what this kind of religious literature talks about. When you talked about mysticism, well, it's a slippery word, but often it is a sense of feeling connected and whole, because you're not alone and isolated, because you're joined with a sense of other people. And you experience that as a connection instead of feeling isolated. And because when awful things happened to me, I felt stigmatized. Like, none of my friends had this happen.
Right.
I mean, I'm the only one, and this is awful. But that's not true at all anymore. And that doesn't even matter that much, because other things happen to everyone.
Right. Yeah. You don't get to. A lot of times you don't know that things have happened to other people.
Yeah,
We don't talk about
yeah,
it.
absolutely. That happens a lot.
Yeah.
And as my late husband used to say, everyone has something like this in their life. And I thought, not this. He said, well, not this, but something. And I resented it at the time.
Yeah.
He was right.
Yeah, I guess he was.
But it's very good to talk and, explore these things.
Yes, yeah. And writing about it and writing a song about it also.
That's right. Yeah.
well.
So now we're gonna
Let's see
write
what
the song.
comes
No.
out of that. What my present husband did. Right?
No. Is he a musician?
He's not a musician. However, he spent the last 35 years on the staff of a rock and roll band
No way.
of somebody we knew when we were in high school, and that was Jerry Garcia.
I read that you knew Jerry Garcia.
We did.
And so he's been working for the Grateful Dead.
Jerry was in the accident that I wrote about,
That's right.
and so was my current husband. They were very close friends,
Wow.
and they both survived, obviously.
Yeah.
And Jerry started the group, and I saw it much later. He started a group called the Grateful Dead. And I was off in graduate school. I was not in the rock and roll world at all. And I thought, oh, that's why he called it the Grateful Dead. It's because of the accident.
Wow.
And it was because of that.
Wow.
So he's not a musician, but he knows how to dance and he loves music.
Mm.
I'll have to tell my mother this. She's a huge
Really?
Grateful Dead. Yeah.
I didn't see that coming.
Well, his name is Alan Tristan.
Alan Tristan.
There's a movie that your mother might know called Long Strange Trip.
I'm familiar with it too. Yeah. I mean, I'm not a huge
well,
Grateful Dead.
Alan-
I'm not as big as my mom, but
I think
you know.
Alan is the producer of that.
No way. Really? Wow. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, he didn't pay for it. He helped put it together because he was there. He was a staff member.
Wow.
So, yeah, part of music. Music was very much part of it.
Yeah. And
And that was about bringing people together. He said that whole community. I mean, I was somewhere else, so I thought it was just a bunch of people getting stoned together. But he
that was
said-
part of it.
He said, well, that could facilitate the way that people came together, and that Jerry himself was a Catholic and
I
very,
did not know that. No.
oh yes, he had a Virgin Mother right there. He wasn't practicing Catholic when we knew him, but it was his culture and his tradition, and he knew what he was doing, trying to bring people together in a positive community,
Mhm.
affirming each other and celebrating life, and the kindness that was often expressed in that group.
Mhm.
People helping each other and
Yeah.
greeting each other, and there's a great
Mm.
generosity in it.
Mhm. Yeah. Kind of a religious experience in its own way.
It was for them,
Mhm.
absolutely.
That's funny how it ties in with the themes of this conversation as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, yes. Yes.
So yeah, I mean, I think that music, has obviously.
This is a picture of Alan, this one.
Oh yeah, well, because
An old
he's such a-
hippie.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you have to look the part, to be working with
Yeah,
the
he
Grateful
does.
Dead. Well,
That's when he
congratulations
first came to Colorado to visit.
again. It's a great picture. You should show Jack. It's a
So
great.
are you going on honeymoon?
Well, not now because we were too busy, but it's this guy here.
Oh, okay.
We're going to go to Turkey in May and
That's exciting.
visit some friends on the side of a mountain and talk,
Wow,
spend time.
that sounds wonderful.
Yeah.
Mm. Well, the song should be ready then. You should have a honeymoon song.
Yes.
Yeah.
So when does the song have to be ready by?
Well, we have no deadline, but did you have any lyrical ideas? Yeah, I mean, Amanda's a wonderful lyricist.
Well, thank you. So the other reason that I really wanted to have a trip around this interview was because I find that I have a 3-year-old at home and
Oh,
she's
wonderful.
very, as you know, time consuming.
Oh, yes. What's her name?
Her name is Tuvi. Tuvi, yeah.
What is the name?
So it means dove or perhaps pigeon in
In what
Estonian.
Estonian.
Yeah, I wanted.
Tuvi, it sounds like it does.
Yeah, so I really wanted to name her Paloma, which Spanish word for dove. And my husband did not like that name. And he asked me, what do you like about that name? And I said, well, I think it's beautiful, but also I like that it means dove. And he pulled up, I mean, the wonders of the internet now, he pulled pulled out we really had every translation of Dove, and we found 2V and sort of we were like, it sounds like a name. It's kind of pretty. I don't know. And we both kind of liked, and that was when I was, it was about 6 months before she was born. So we had time to think about it, but that's that. And now she's very much 2V. So it's funny how kids grow into their names, but it's funny because I have a friend whose husband does Balkan studies, and he that's like he's an academic, and he was at a like a conference with a Balkan studies conference. I don't even know how to talk about that. I don't know what they were doing, but there were some Estonian scholars there, and he mentioned that to them, that a friend of his had a daughter named Tuvi, and what did they think about that? And they were kind of like, oh, yeah, it's not a name, but it's nice. So I was just glad that they didn't say like, oh, that's actually a slang word that we use for something not so great. So it's like, just keep her out of Estonian. But yeah, so that's anyway. So I find that I don't write as much at home these days. But I was hoping to kind of have a few days now. I'm gonna go up and visit friends in New York, and then I'll have a night. I'm gonna stay in a hotel to split up the drive home on the way back, and I'm hoping to be able to get some ideas down on the long drive. And,
It'll happen.
yeah. And
Well, good.
yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. Well, you've given us so much inspiration for it.
I said to Elaine and Ina, I said, I honestly think that even just from reading her books, there's so much there. So I was excited to talk and just see where the conversation led us.
Well, all over the map.
All over the map. I don't even know. I think we actually talked about most of my questions that I had. So.
Yeah. Well, very
wonderful.
Good. I'm glad it's a long way for you to come, but
yeah, well,
I think it's good to do that. I mean, I've taught on Zoom for a year and a half, and it's very useful to see you. It's very different from not seeing you and just having you. But being in person is something I've really come to appreciate a lot. Yeah,
it's nice. I wanted to be able to be in the room. I just feel like it's nice, especially maybe after the pandemic. It's nice to be able to like hear somebody breathe, kind of get a sense of vitality.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I live in Italy, so I can't go around all these places. Most of my guests are in America, so I'm very grateful for Zoom. But yeah,
do you live there?
I am jealous. Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Lovely.
Yeah. Were you born there?
No, I'm English, but my girlfriend's Italian. I've been here 10 years now, so.
Very nice. Yeah.
Well, Ellen is English too.
Oh, okay.
Grew up in London.
Oh.
Yeah. So.
Oh, you have to go back to visit.
Oh yes,
I do. For whatever reason, it's like all the times that we've toured in the UK, the guys in my band are always like, they complain. They're all very tall, and they always complain that all the doors are short and the towers are too small. Nobody gives you enough water to drink, and the beer is warm. But they have all these complaints, and they have all said to me at some point, like, I really miss touring in the UK. We haven't been. I miss it. But I always miss sort of the minutia of touring. Like I don't know, Jack, if you ever go to Morrison's.
I have been, yeah.
Yeah, so we always eat breakfast at Morrison's when we're over there.
Wow.
We had a tour manager when we first started touring over there he lived and died by breakfast at Morrison's. So it was very affordable. And I miss that. I'm like, I would love to go to like this supermarket cafe and like get a cup of tea.
I guess it sounds funny for me to, but then if it's for us to say to go to, the 7-Eleven or the
exactly. It would be like
for pancakes. Yeah.
I want to go to America and just go to the 7-Eleven and have a slushie.
Well, all right. Well, let me know.
All right.
When you come up with some inspiration.
I will. Yeah, we'll keep in touch. And I guess talking, Jack.
Yeah, we'll keep talking by email and collaborate remotely.
Yes. Well, I'm sorry you couldn't be here, but thank you for asking me to do this and bringing it into being.
My pleasure. Lovely to meet you both.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Saw Jesus in a parking lot.
He said to give the world what I got, but nobody believed me. Yeah, they said I was crazy, and now it's gonna turn me to stone like milk for the baby. Never came home is the saddest thing that you've ever known, and can't nobody save me. Sometimes the heart breaks just like an egg hatching, and tiny and barely breathing, and hungry for some meaning. Sometimes the world laughs, it's trying to hold the tears back. Sometimes we're lonely, sometimes we're only dreaming. We were short on miracles, guess they needed them for the war. So we said, we don't believe in miracles anymore. But I don't wanna be scared to love, I don't wanna be scared to hold, I don't wanna be scared to call out, just 'cause there might be no answer. She misses her brother today and asked me why he went away. I said, honey, it's beyond me. I've been trying to wrap my mind around the whole damn thing, trying to find the truth, trying to make it sing. 'Cause sometimes the truth just seems so ugly.